In the grand halls where power echoes through marble corridors and whispered secrets can topple kingdoms, one woman's desperate lie was about to collide with an unbreakable force. Lady Margaret Ashworth thought she held all the cards when she pointed her trembling finger at the most feared man in the royal court. She believed her noble blood and feminine tears would shield her from consequence. She was wrong. What happens when an entitled aristocrat tries to destroy an innocent man, only to discover that some people cannot be broken, some reputations cannot be tarnished, and some truths refuse to stay buried? This is the story of how a single accusation unraveled not just one woman's carefully constructed life, but exposed the rot that had been festering in the highest circles of power for years. It's about justice served cold, truth emerging from shadows, and how sometimes the very weapon you use against others becomes the instrument of your own destruction. The royal guard she tried to ruin didn't just defend himself. He dismantled her entire world, piece by calculated piece, until nothing remained but the echo of her lies and the weight of her shame. Some battles are fought with swords. Others are won with truth. This is the latter. The autumn rain hammered against the stained glass windows of Raven's Hollow Castle as Lady Margaret Ashworth gathered her silk skirts and hurried through the torchlit corridors. Her emerald eyes, usually sparkling with mischief and entitlement, now burned with a different kind of fire. Revenge had been brewing in her heart for 3 months, ever since Captain James Blackthorne had publicly refused her advances at the Harvest Festival. Margaret's heels clicked sharply against the cold stone floors as she made her way to the throne room. The sound echoed through the empty hallways like a countdown to destruction. She had rehearsed this moment dozens of times in her private chambers, practicing her tears, perfecting her trembling voice, and crafting the perfect story that would bring down the man who had dared to humiliate her in front of half the kingdom's nobility. Captain Blackthorne represented everything Margaret despised about the changing times. Born a commoner, he had risen through the ranks purely through merit, becoming the youngest captain of the Royal Guard in the kingdom's history. His integrity was legendary, his loyalty unquestioned, and his rejection of her had been swift, decisive, and utterly public. The memory of his words still stung like a fresh wound. "Lady Ashworth," he had said that night, his voice carrying clearly across the festival grounds, "I appreciate your interest, but I must respectfully decline. My duty is to the crown, and my heart belongs elsewhere." The assembled nobles had tried to hide their smirks behind their wine goblets, but Margaret had seen every suppressed smile, every exchanged glance. The daughter of the Duke of Ashworth, one of the most powerful families in the realm, had been rejected by a man who should have been grateful for even a moment of her attention. As Margaret approached the massive oak doors of the throne room, she could hear the murmur of voices within. Perfect. The morning court session was in full swing, which meant King Edward would be surrounded by his advisors, nobles, and, most importantly, witnesses. The more people present for her performance, the more devastating the impact would be on Blackthorne's reputation. She paused outside the doors, taking deep breaths to summon the tears she would need. Margaret had always been gifted at manipulation, a skill honed through years of getting her way in a world that catered to her every whim. Her father's wealth and influence had always ensured that doors opened for her, that obstacles disappeared, and that consequences rarely touched her privileged life. The guard at the door recognized her immediately and bowed respectfully before pushing open the heavy doors. The throne room fell silent as Margaret stumbled inside, her face a masterpiece of distress and barely contained hysteria. Her golden hair was deliberately disheveled, her gown torn at the shoulder in a way that suggested struggle without revealing too much. Tears streamed down her porcelain cheeks as she collapsed to her knees before the throne. "Your Majesty," she sobbed, her voice breaking at precisely the right moments, I beg for your protection and justice. I have been grievously wronged by one I trusted, one who wears your colors and claims to serve your crown." King Edward leaned forward in his throne, his weathered face creased with concern. At 62, he had ruled for over 3 decades, and his experience had taught him to listen carefully before passing judgment. However, the sight of a noble lady in such obvious distress demanded immediate attention. "Lady Margaret," the king said gently, "compose yourself and tell us what has happened. You are under our protection here." Margaret's performance was flawless. She allowed herself to tremble visibly, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief while maintaining just enough composure to be understood. "Captain Blackthorne, your majesty. He forced himself upon me last evening. I was walking alone in the castle gardens, seeking solitude to contemplate the beauty of your realm, when he approached me with words of false comfort." The gasps that rippled through the assembled court were exactly what Margaret had hoped for. She could see the shock and disgust on the faces around her, the immediate assumption of guilt that would follow her words. In a society where a woman's reputation was everything, such accusations were taken with utmost seriousness. "He said that he had reconsidered my feelings for him," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength as she built her lie. "But when I expressed my joy, he revealed his true intentions. He said that if I would not come to him willingly, he would take what he desired by force. He is a strong man, your majesty, and I could not resist his advances." The king's face had grown thunderous, his hands gripping the arms of his throne until his knuckles were white. "These are grave accusations, Lady Margaret. You understand the weight of what you are claiming." "I do, your majesty," Margaret replied, rising to her feet with perfect dramatic timing. "I know that my words may seem impossible to believe. Captain Blackthorne has a reputation for honor and integrity, but I swear upon my family's name and the memory of my sainted mother that every word I speak is truth. He violated me, and then threatened me with worse if I should dare to speak of it." Lord Chancellor Williams, a thin man with silver hair and calculating eyes, stepped forward. He had always been suspicious of common-born officers rising too quickly through the ranks, and this accusation fit perfectly with his worldview. "Your Majesty, if these accusations prove true, the matter is clear. The punishment for such crimes against a noble lady is death." Margaret felt a thrill of satisfaction course through her veins. Everything was proceeding exactly as she had planned. The seeds of doubt had been planted, the court was on her side, and Blackthorne's sterling reputation was about to be torn to shreds. She had expected him to be present for the morning session, but his absence only worked in her favor, making him seem guilty and cowardly. "Where is Captain Blackthorne?" King Edward demanded, his voice echoing through the great hall. "Summon him immediately. He will answer these charges before this court." A young page scurried from the room to fetch the accused man, while Margaret continued to play her part perfectly. She accepted the comfort offered by the noble ladies present, allowing them to fuss over her and whisper words of sympathy and outrage. Each supportive word, each disgusted glance toward the door where Blackthorne would soon appear, added another stone to the wall of condemnation she was building around him. Lady Catherine Fairfax, the king's own sister, approached Margaret with genuine concern etched on her features. "My dear child," she said softly, "you are so brave to come forward. Too many women suffer in silence when men abuse their power and position." Margaret nodded gratefully, squeezing Lady Catherine's hand as if drawing strength from her support. "I feared no one would believe me, your majesty. Captain Blackthorne is so respected, so trusted, but I could not live with the shame and silence. I could not allow him to do this to another innocent woman." The calculated nobility of her words drew murmurs of approval from the assembled court. Margaret had positioned herself not just as a victim, but as a hero protecting other potential victims. It was a masterstroke that would make it even more difficult for anyone to question her story without seeming callous and heartless. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited for Blackthorne to arrive. Margaret used the time to solidify her support, accepting sympathy and sharing carefully edited details of her fabricated assault. She spoke of her terror, her helplessness, and her reluctant decision to seek justice despite the personal cost to her reputation. Finally, the great doors swung open again, and Captain James Blackthorne strode into the throne room with his usual confident bearing. At 31, he was tall and lean, with dark hair and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing proud, but respectful. He walked like a man with nothing to hide and nothing to fear. Margaret watched his entrance with carefully concealed satisfaction. He looked so composed, so certain of his innocence. That confidence would make his fall all the more satisfying when her lies inevitably destroyed him. She had crafted her story too carefully, planted too much evidence, and gathered too much sympathy for him to escape unscathed. Blackthorne stopped before the throne and executed a perfect military bow. "Your Majesty, you summoned me." The king's voice was cold as winter steel when he responded. "Captain Blackthorne, you stand accused of a most heinous crime. Lady Margaret Ashworth claims that you assaulted her in the castle gardens last evening. What say you to these charges?" For a moment, Blackthorne's composure wavered. Margaret watched with delight as surprise, then confusion, then understanding flashed across his features. She could practically see his mind working, trying to comprehend how this impossible situation had come to pass. "Your Majesty," Blackthorne said slowly, his voice steady despite the shock, "I categorically deny these accusations. I was not in the castle gardens last evening, nor have I ever behaved inappropriately toward Lady Margaret or any other woman in this court." Margaret allowed herself a small, sad smile. "I expected him to deny it, Your Majesty. What man would willingly admit to such dishonor? But denial does not change the truth of what happened to me." The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood Lady Margaret Ashworth, daughter of a duke, supported by the sympathy of the court and protected by her noble blood. On the other stood Captain James Blackthorne, a common-born soldier whose only weapons were his integrity and his truth. Margaret was certain she had already won. After all, who would believe the word of a commoner over that of a noble lady? She had played this game her entire life and never lost. She had no reason to believe this time would be any different. But as she looked into Blackthorne's eyes, she saw something that gave her the slightest pause. There was no fear there, no panic, no desperate calculation. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like pity, as if he already knew something she did not. The captain stood straighter, his voice ringing clear and true through the throne room. "Your Majesty, I understand the seriousness of these accusations, and I welcome any investigation into my conduct. I have served this crown faithfully for 15 years, and my record speaks for itself. I am confident that the truth will vindicate me completely." Margaret's smile faltered slightly. His confidence should have been shattered by now. He should have been stammering excuses, begging for mercy, or at least showing some sign of the fear that any guilty man would feel when confronted with evidence of his crimes. Instead, James Blackthorne stood before his king like a man who had nothing to hide, and everything to gain from the truth being revealed. It was not the reaction Margaret had expected, and for the first time since she had conceived this plan, a tiny seed of doubt began to grow in the back of her mind. But she pushed that doubt away. She had come too far to turn back now. Her reputation, her pride, and her desire for revenge demanded that she see this through to the bitter end. Besides, what could a common-born guard possibly know or do that could threaten her carefully constructed lies? Margaret had no idea that she was about to find out exactly what Captain James Blackthorne was capable of when his honor, his career, and his very life hung in the balance. The game she thought she had already won was only just beginning. King Edward's weathered hands drummed against the arm of his throne as he considered the explosive situation before him. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor where two very different versions of truth stood in opposition. The weight of judgment pressed heavily upon his shoulders, as it had countless times throughout his long reign, but rarely had the stakes felt quite so personal. "Lord Chancellor Williams," the king commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the throne. "I want a thorough investigation conducted immediately. Question everyone who might have knowledge of the events Lady Margaret describes. Check the guard rotations, speak with the servants, examine the gardens. Leave no stone unturned." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach, quickly suppressed. She had anticipated this response and prepared accordingly. The evidence she had planted would be discovered exactly as she intended, leading inexorably to Blackthorn's downfall. Her maid, Elena, had been well paid to support the story, and Margaret had even gone so far as to tear her own dress and dirty it with garden soil. Captain Blackthorn remained at attention, his face a mask of professional composure. "Your Majesty, I welcome any investigation and will cooperate fully. However, I respectfully request that I be allowed to remain on duty until proven guilty. My men depend on my leadership, and the castle's security should not be compromised based on unproven accusations." The audacity of his request sent murmurs through the assembled nobles. Most men in his position would have begged for mercy or at least attempted to flee. Instead, Blackthorn was asking to continue serving, as if his innocence was so certain that the investigation was merely a formality. Lady Catherine stepped forward, her loyalty to her brother evident in every word. "Edward, surely the captain cannot remain in his position while under such serious allegations. The safety and comfort of the court ladies must be considered." King Edward nodded slowly. "Captain Blackthorn will be confined to quarters pending the investigation's conclusion. However, I will not strip him of rank or title until the truth is determined. Sir Marcus will assume temporary command of the guard." Margaret watched as Sir Marcus, Blackthorn's second in command, stepped forward to accept the temporary promotion. The older knight's face was grim, caught between loyalty to his captain and duty to the crown. She could see the doubt in his eyes, the struggle between what he knew of Blackthorn's character and the serious nature of the accusations. As the court began to disperse, Margaret played her part perfectly, accepting the continued comfort of the noble ladies while shooting occasional fearful glances at Blackthorn. She noticed how several of the guards looked at their former captain with expressions ranging from confusion to disappointment. The seed of doubt had been planted successfully. But as she watched Blackthorn being escorted from the throne room, Margaret caught something unexpected in his demeanor. There was no slump of defeat in his shoulders, no desperate backward glance of a man watching his world collapse. Instead, he walked with the same steady confidence he had always displayed, as if he were simply going about his normal duties. Within hours, Lord Chancellor Williams had assembled a team of investigators, and the castle buzzed with activity. Servants whispered in corners, guards spoke in hushed tones, and nobles gathered in small groups to discuss the shocking turn of events. Margaret made sure to be visible throughout the day, accepting sympathy and maintaining her role as the brave victim seeking justice. The first breakthrough came exactly as Margaret had planned. Elena, her personal maid, was brought before the investigators in the castle's small council chamber. The young woman's hands trembled convincingly as she recounted her prepared story. "I was waiting for Lady Margaret to return from her evening walk," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When she came back to her chambers, her dress was torn and dirty. She was crying and shaking terribly. When I asked what had happened, she could barely speak at first. Finally, she told me about Captain Blackthorn's attack." Lord Chancellor Williams leaned forward, his sharp features intent. Did Lady Margaret seem genuinely distressed? Or could she have been acting? Elena's eyes widened with apparent shock. "Oh no, my lord. Lady Margaret was truly terrified. I have served her for 3 years, and I have never seen her in such a state. She made me promise not to tell anyone, but she was so frightened that he might hurt her again." Margaret listened to Elena's testimony from her chambers, satisfied with how well her maid was playing her part. The girl had been promised a substantial sum of gold and a position in another noble household far from Ravenshollow. It was a small price to pay for Blackthorn's destruction. But as the investigation continued, strange inconsistencies began to emerge. The head gardener, old Thomas, was questioned about the condition of the gardens the morning after the alleged assault. His testimony proved troubling for those expecting to find supporting evidence. "The garden paths were pristine yesterday morning, my lords," Thomas stated firmly. "I walked them every dawn to check for damage or problems. There were no signs of any struggle, no disturbed plantings, no scuff marks in the gravel. If there had been any kind of violent encounter in my gardens, I would have seen the evidence." The investigators exchanged glances. A struggle violent enough to tear a lady's dress should have left some trace in the meticulously maintained garden paths. They pressed Thomas for more details. "The Lady Margaret claims the assault occurred near the rose arbor," one investigator noted. "Surely such an encounter would have damaged the flowers or disturbed the soil?" Thomas shook his head definitively. "The roses were untouched, my lord. Not a single bloom was broken, not a single branch disturbed. I stake my reputation as head gardener on this truth." Meanwhile, another team of investigators was examining the guard rotations and duty rosters. Sir Marcus provided them with detailed records of who was stationed where during the previous evening. What they discovered began to cast serious doubt on Lady Margaret's timeline. According to these records, the lead investigator announced to Lord Chancellor Williams, Captain Blackthorne was conducting his evening inspection of the outer walls from 8 o'clock until nearly midnight. He was accompanied by Lieutenant Davies for the entire inspection. Williams frowned. The alleged assault was supposed to have occurred around 9 o'clock, when Lady Margaret claimed to be taking her evening stroll. If Blackthorne could prove his whereabouts during that time, the entire accusation would crumble. Lieutenant Davies was summoned immediately. The young officer was nervous but precise in his recollection of the previous evening's duties. "Captain Blackthorne and I inspected every section of the outer defenses," Davies reported. "We began at the eastern tower and worked our way around the entire perimeter. The captain was meticulous, as always, checking every guard post and examining the walls for any signs of weakness or damage." "You were with him the entire time?" Williams pressed. "Yes, my lord. We did not separate even for a moment. The captain takes security very seriously and never delegates such important inspections to subordinates." Williams felt the first stirrings of unease. If Davies was telling the truth, and if the guard roster was accurate, then Blackthorne had an ironclad alibi for the time of the alleged assault. But that would mean Lady Margaret was lying, which seemed impossible. What motive could she possibly have for making such a devastating false accusation? The investigation took another unexpected turn when the castle's head steward was questioned about the evening's activities. Master Aldrich had served in the castle for over 20 years and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the daily routines and habits of every resident. Lady Margaret did indeed go for an evening walk, Aldrich confirmed. However, she returned to her chambers at approximately 8:30, not 10 o'clock as she claimed. "I know this because I was supervising the evening meal cleanup when she passed through the main hall." The timeline was becoming increasingly problematic for Margaret's story. If she had returned to her chambers by 8:30 and Blackthorne had been on the outer walls from 8 o'clock onward, when could the alleged assault have taken place? But the most damaging revelation was yet to come. As investigators combed through the castle's daily records, they discovered something that nobody had expected. Lady Margaret's own previous statements, made to various servants and nobles over the past few months, painted a very different picture of her relationship with Captain Blackthorne. Margaret's personal seamstress revealed that the lady had spent considerable time discussing her attraction to the captain, even commissioning special gowns designed to catch his attention at various court functions. Her dance instructor mentioned how Margaret had specifically requested to learn the captain's favorite dances, hoping to impress him at the harvest festival. Most damaging of all was the testimony of Margaret's own cousin, Lady Jennifer Ashworth, who had been visiting the castle for the past month. Jennifer was younger than Margaret and had always been somewhat intimidated by her older cousin's forceful personality, but the seriousness of the situation compelled her to speak truthfully. Margaret was quite vocal about her feelings for Captain Blackthorne. Jennifer admitted reluctantly to the investigators. She spoke of him constantly, planning ways to gain his attention and affection. After the harvest festival, she was furious about his public rejection. She said terrible things about him, calling him ungrateful and arrogant. She swore that she would make him pay for humiliating her. The investigators felt the pieces of a very different puzzle beginning to fall into place. Instead of a noble assault victim seeking justice, they were looking at a woman scorned, seeking revenge through false accusations. Lord Chancellor Williams found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. As someone who had initially supported Lady Margaret's claims, he now faced the possibility that he had been manipulated into pursuing an innocent man. The political implications were staggering, not just for Margaret and Blackthorn, but for the entire system of noble justice. While the investigation continued, Captain Blackthorn remained in his quarters, maintaining his dignity despite the circumstances. He had been stripped of his weapons and confined, but visitors were still permitted. A steady stream of guards, servants, and even some nobles came to see him, many expressing their disbelief at the accusations. Sir Marcus visited daily, bringing reports on the guards' morale and the castle's security. "The men are struggling, James," he admitted during one visit. "They know your character, but the accusations are so serious that some are beginning to have doubts." Blackthorn nodded calmly. "I understand their position, Marcus. They have families to protect and careers to consider. I hold no grudge against any man who feels he must distance himself from me during this investigation. But how can you remain so calm?" Marcus demanded. "Your life hangs in the balance based on the word of a vindictive woman, and you sit here as if you're simply waiting for tea to be served." For the first time since the accusations were made, Blackthorn smiled. It was not a bitter or cynical expression, but something that suggested knowledge beyond the current circumstances. "Because, my friend, truth has a way of revealing itself. Lady Margaret has crafted an elaborate lie, but lies require perfect execution to survive scrutiny. The more investigators dig, the more they will find that her story cannot withstand examination." Marcus leaned forward, intrigued. "What do you know that the rest of us do not?" Blackthorn's smile widened slightly. "I know that I am innocent, and I know that Lady Margaret is not as clever as she believes herself to be. Patience, Marcus. Justice may be slow, but it is rarely blind for long." As the third day of investigation drew to a close, the accumulated evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The timeline didn't match. The physical evidence was absent. The witnesses contradicted key elements of Margaret's story, and her own previous statements suggested a very different motive for the accusations. But perhaps most damaging of all was what the investigators discovered when they interviewed the castle's night watchman, old Pierre, who had been overlooked in the initial questioning because of his reputation for drinking. When they finally spoke with him, his testimony proved to be the most explosive yet. "I saw Lady Margaret in the gardens that evening." Pierre slurred slightly, his breath still carrying the scent of wine. "But she wasn't being attacked by anyone. She was alone, tearing at her own dress and rolling around in the dirt near the fountain. Thought she'd gone mad. I did, but figure it wasn't my place to interfere with noble ladies and their strange habits." The investigators stared at each other in shock. If Pierre's testimony was accurate, it meant that Lady Margaret had deliberately staged the physical evidence of her own assault. Combined with everything else they had discovered, it painted a picture of calculated deception that was breathtaking in its audacity. Lord Chancellor Williams realized that he was facing a situation that would shake the very foundations of the court's trust in noble testimony. If Lady Margaret had indeed fabricated these accusations, the implications extended far beyond a simple case of false witness. It would call into question the entire system of justice that relied on the assumed honesty of the nobility. But there was one more revelation waiting in the wings, one that would not only prove Blackthorn's innocence beyond any doubt, but would also expose the true depth of Margaret's deception. The captain had been patient throughout the investigation, confident that truth would prevail, but he had been far from passive. Unknown to everyone except his most trusted allies, James Blackthorne had spent the past 3 days quietly gathering evidence of his own. And what he had discovered would not only destroy Margaret's accusations, but would reveal secrets that she had never intended to expose. The real battle was about to begin. The fourth day of the investigation dawned gray and overcast, as if the very sky reflected the mood that had settled over Ravenshollow Castle. Word of the mounting evidence against Lady Margaret's story had begun to spread through the corridors, carried by servants' whispers and nobles' worried conversations. The certainty that had initially surrounded the case was cracking like ice in spring, revealing dangerous depths beneath. Captain James Blackthorne had requested a formal audience with King Edward, claiming he had evidence that would conclusively prove his innocence. Lord Chancellor Williams, now deeply concerned about the direction of the investigation, had reluctantly agreed to arrange the meeting. The throne room was packed with nobles, all eager to witness what promised to be the climactic moment in a scandal that had consumed the castle for days. Lady Margaret arrived dressed in funeral black, her face pale and drawn. The confident woman who had stridden into the throne room 4 days earlier had been replaced by someone who looked increasingly desperate. Her hands trembled slightly as she took her place among the other nobles, and her eyes darted nervously toward the doors through which Blackthorne would soon enter. The whispered conversations that filled the great hall fell silent as the captain was escorted in by 2 guards. But instead of the defeated man many expected to see, Blackthorne carried himself with the same dignity and confidence he had always displayed. More significantly, he carried a leather portfolio under his arm, thick with documents and what appeared to be physical evidence. King Edward leaned forward in his throne, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. "Captain Blackthorne, you have requested this audience claiming to possess evidence of your innocence. Present your case." Blackthorne stepped forward and executed a perfect bow before turning to face the assembled court. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly through the vast chamber, each word precisely chosen and delivered with the confidence of absolute truth. "Your Majesty, honored nobles, I stand before you not just to prove my innocence, but to reveal a conspiracy of deception that threatens the very foundations of justice in this realm. Lady Margaret Ashworth has not simply made a false accusation. She has orchestrated an elaborate campaign of lies, bribery, and manipulation that extends far beyond her claims against me." Margaret's face went ashen, but she forced herself to speak. "Your Majesty, surely you will not allow this man to compound his crimes by making wild accusations against his victim?" But Blackthorne was already opening his portfolio, removing the first piece of evidence with the practiced efficiency of a military strategist. "I shall present my evidence methodically, allowing each piece to speak for itself." He held up a small leather pouch that jingled softly with the sound of coins. This was discovered hidden in the chambers of Elena Vasquez, Lady Margaret's personal maid. It contains 50 gold pieces, more than Elena could earn in 5 years of service. The coins are newly minted, bearing the seal of the Ashworth treasury. Elena, who was present in the hall, gasped audibly and tried to shrink back into the crowd. But Blackthorne's allies had anticipated this moment, and she found her way blocked by loyal guards. Furthermore, Blackthorne continued, "Elena has admitted, when confronted with this evidence, that Lady Margaret paid her to provide false testimony about the night in question. She has signed a full confession, which I present to the court." Lord Chancellor Williams accepted the document with hands that shook slightly. As he read Elena's detailed confession, his face grew increasingly grave. The maid had detailed not only her false testimony, but also Margaret's entire plan, including the deliberate destruction of her own dress and the careful timing of her accusations. Margaret's voice rose shrilly as desperation began to overtake calculated performance. "Elena is lying now to save herself. She was always jealous of my position and has clearly been corrupted by this man's gold." But Blackthorne was far from finished. "Your Majesty, if I may direct the court's attention to Lady Margaret's own words recorded in her private diary, which was discovered during a search of her chambers. He produced a small book bound in pink silk, its pages covered in Margaret's distinctive handwriting. With the court's permission, I will read selected passages that detail her true feelings and intentions regarding myself. The king nodded grimly, and Blackthorn opened the diary to passages he had marked with small ribbons. His voice remained steady and professional as he read words that grew increasingly damaging with each sentence. From the entry dated 3 weeks after the harvest festival, that arrogant commoner dared to reject me in front of half the court. He will pay for this humiliation. I have been thinking of ways to destroy his precious reputation. Perhaps accusations of impropriety would serve. After all, who would believe the word of a common soldier over that of a duke's daughter? Gasps echoed through the throne room as the true nature of Margaret's motivations became clear. But Blackthorn continued reading, his voice growing colder with each revelation. From 2 weeks later, I have been observing Blackthorn's routines and duties. His evening inspections follow a predictable pattern, but there are times when he is alone and vulnerable to accusation. I must plan this carefully to ensure maximum damage to his reputation. Margaret lunged forward, desperation overcoming all pretense of dignity. Those entries are forgeries. This man has somehow gained access to my private chambers and planted false evidence. But even as she spoke, several of her own servants were nodding in recognition. Her handwriting was distinctive, and many of them had seen examples of it on household instructions and personal correspondence. The diary's authenticity was unmistakable. Blackthorn was not yet done with his revelations. Your Majesty, there is more. Lady Margaret's conspiracy extends beyond simple false accusations. Investigation into her finances reveals systematic theft from the castle's charitable funds, money intended for orphans, and widows that she has diverted to her own accounts. He produced ledgers and bank records that painted a picture of corruption spanning several years. Margaret had been using her position as overseer of the castle's charity work to embezzle substantial sums, confident that her noble status would protect her from scrutiny. The amount stolen totals over 3,000 gold pieces, Blackthorn announced. Money that should have fed hungry children and provided shelter for homeless families instead funded Lady Margaret's expensive gowns and jewelry. The revelation hit the assembled nobles like a physical blow. Theft was serious enough, but stealing from charitable funds intended for the most vulnerable members of society was beyond contempt. Several of the ladies who had initially supported Margaret now looked at her with expressions of disgust and betrayal. But Blackthorn's most devastating revelation was yet to come. Finally, Your Majesty, I present evidence of Lady Margaret's involvement in treason against the crown itself. The word treason sent a shock through the throne room that was almost palpable. King Edward rose from his throne, his face dark with anger and concern. Explain yourself, Captain. Blackthorn produced a series of letters bearing official seals from neighboring kingdoms. These correspondence were found hidden in Lady Margaret's chambers. They detail her communications with agents of King Frederick of Aldoria, our kingdom's greatest enemy. She has been selling information about our military preparations, guard rotations, and defensive strategies in exchange for gold and promises a position in Frederick's court should he succeed in conquering our realm. Margaret's mask finally slipped completely. You cannot prove those letters are genuine. They could be forgeries planted by enemies of my family. But Blackthorn was prepared for this objection as well. The letters are written in Lady Margaret's own hand and sealed with her personal signet ring. Moreover, Sir Marcus has confirmed that several pieces of sensitive military information mentioned in these letters were known only to a very small number of people, including Lady Margaret, who learned them through her position on the castle social committee. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Margaret stood exposed not just as a vindictive liar, but as a thief and a traitor to the crown. The woman who had entered the throne room 4 days earlier with such confidence and Moral authority was revealed to be everything she had accused Blackthorn of being, and far worse. King Edward's voice shook with rage when he finally spoke. Lady Margaret Ashworth, you stand accused of false witness, theft, embezzlement, and high treason. How do you answer these charges? For a moment, Margaret seemed to crumble under the weight of her exposed crimes. But then, in a final desperate gambit, she straightened and pointed an accusatory finger at Blackthorn. This is all an elaborate revenge plot, she shrieked. He has manufactured this evidence to destroy me, because I dare to speak the truth about his crimes. Every piece of supposed evidence has been planted or forged. But her protests fell on deaf ears. The assembled court had seen too much genuine evidence, heard too many corroborating testimonies, and witnessed too many contradictions in her own story to believe any further denials. The tide had turned completely against her, and even her most loyal supporters were beginning to distance themselves from her obvious guilt. Blackthorn's final stroke was perhaps the most elegant of all. Your Majesty, Lady Margaret claims that all evidence against her has been fabricated. I would like to point out that such an elaborate conspiracy would require the cooperation of dozens of people, including her own servants, the castle's financial officers, foreign agents, and even Lady Margaret's own hand in writing these letters and diary entries. He paused, letting the absurdity of such a vast conspiracy sink in before delivering his conclusion. It would be far easier to believe that a woman scorned by public rejection might concoct a false accusation for revenge, especially when that same woman has already proven herself capable of theft and treason. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. The logic was unassailable. Margaret's conspiracy theory would have required more planning and coordination than mounting a military campaign, while the explanation of her guilt explained all the evidence perfectly. Lord Chancellor Williams, who had initially been one of Margaret's strongest supporters, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge her obvious guilt. Your Majesty, he said formally, the evidence presented appears conclusive. Lady Margaret Ashworth is guilty of making false accusations against Captain Blackthorn, and, far more seriously, of theft and treason against the crown. Margaret's final facade crumbled as she realized that her situation was hopeless. The tears that streamed down her face now were genuine, born of fear and despair rather than calculated manipulation. She had gambled everything on destroying an innocent man and had instead destroyed herself completely. King Edward's judgment, when it came, was swift and merciless. Lady Margaret Ashworth, you have betrayed not only Captain Blackthorn, but this entire court, the poor and defenseless who depended on your charity and ultimately your own kingdom. You are hereby stripped of all titles, lands, and properties. You will be imprisoned pending transfer to our enemies in Valdoria, where you can enjoy the company of those you chose to serve. Margaret collapsed to her knees, the weight of her ruined life finally breaking her completely. The woman who had entered this room with such arrogance and certainty was leaving it with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge that her own actions had brought about her total destruction. But Captain Blackthorn's vindication was not yet complete. The king had one more pronouncement to make, one that would restore not just the captain's honor, but elevate it to new heights. Captain James Blackthorn, King Edward declared, his voice carrying the full weight of royal authority, you have not only proven your innocence, but have uncovered threats to this kingdom that might otherwise have gone undetected. Your loyalty, integrity, and skill have saved lives and protected our realm from enemies both within and without. The king paused, allowing his words to resonate through the silent throne room. Therefore, it is my pleasure to promote you to the rank of Knight Commander of the Royal Guard, with all the privileges, responsibilities, and honors that position entails. You have proven yourself worthy of the highest trust this crown can bestow. The throne room erupted in applause as Blackthorn knelt to receive his new honors. The man who had been facing execution for crimes he never committed was now elevated to one of the highest positions in the kingdom. It was a reversal of fortune that seemed almost impossible, but it was also perfectly just. As Margaret was led away in chains, her reputation in ruins, and her future bleak, Blackthorn rose as Sir James, Knight Commander, his integrity not just intact, but enhanced by the trials he had endured. The contrast between their fates was stark and undeniable. Justice had been served, but the reverberations of Margaret's conspiracy would be felt throughout the kingdom for years to come. Her downfall had exposed weaknesses in the system that needed to be addressed, and her betrayal had reminded everyone that honor and nobility were not automatically conferred by birth, but had to be earned through character and action. The game that Margaret thought she had won before it even began had indeed ended, but not at all as she had planned.